Hello, my friends. This is John Edward Willie, and today I'm walking and wandering and wondering aloud about the problem of consciousness. That is, the question as to how our brains produce conscious experience. On the one level, it is a technical question, that is a scientific question as to how the brain precisely could be understood as something that gives way to the inner life that we have. But on the other hand, given that we have the experience that we have and that it's not reducible to any objective understanding that we have about the brains, except to say that in principle, the mind is a function of the brain, we discover that there is, in fact, a question without an answer. That is, there is what is called an explanatory gap. An explanatory gap is like what I've described in other videos as being a gap in intelligibility, meaning that what we do not have is a unified, certain view of the world which is consistent and coherent. What we discover is a structure which is ripped apart by schisms and ruptures and impossible gaps between principles which we have to take to be the case. And so I've explored these through different questions, which in their own way represent different aporias or gaps in intelligibility. For instance, I'd brought up the difference between the kind of tenderness that we might offer others in private and the kind of ways in which we have to think socially about other people, which doesn't allow us to be so tender, which in fact demands another kind of intensity from us, or another kind, perhaps, of a sense of justice. And that's one example of other questions which we as humans and being humans live with. Questions which sustain not superfluous or false questions, but serious questions as to how, as in another example, we can think about the tension between free will and determinism. In another video, I'd illustrated the various tensions in our experience and our understanding, tensions between what we take to be determined and what we must assume to be a function of free will. That is, there's a tension between what we blame in others and what we cannot blame. That is, there are things that perhaps we cannot even praise in others because they are incapable of being other than, meaning that there are differences in the ways that we tend to think about different situations which reflect an underlying fracturing, an underlying breaking point, or an aporia, as I've called it. This is what I have today called an explanatory gap, because that phrase is used in regards to another kind of aporia, which exists in many ways between the so-called mind and the body. But in the last video, I had explored that kind of question, which is the question of how the mind and the body can relate, how it is that the mind can have an effect on the body, that is, we can choose to do things, while at the same time assuming that the brain is, of course, causing our thoughts, causing our experience. But the question of consciousness is related, but in many ways a different kind of question, because rather than being the kind of problem which is nestled between different points of view, it's a fundamental mystery in itself. In fact, there are many questions about the brain which are scientific questions, but then there is what scientists call the hard question, what philosophers call the hard question. That is the question about consciousness, which cannot be so easily even understood in scientific terms. That is, there is an element of consciousness which resist, in principle, the very ways in which we go about understanding things. And so perhaps it's better to step back and to think about this question a little bit more broadly, a little bit more deeply, because the question of consciousness has to do with the difference between a first-person point of view and a third-person point of view. And so, in short, the question of consciousness is how we can have at all a first-person point of view, and yet understand ourselves, so to speak, from a third-person point of view. Meaning that what we know is that we can open up the brain using the most advanced technology, and we can understand the correlatives. That is, we can understand the relation between neurons and brain states and mental states. And yet, what we cannot understand is consciousness itself as it is experience. We cannot understand what philosophers call the qualia. The qualia being the experience of what something tastes like for you, or what something looks like for you. Qualia is a word that refers to the particularity of first-person experience. And so the gap in our knowledge has to do with the gap between the very experience which is uniquely for you and like you, and how we would go about understanding experience as such. And this doesn't only refer to or apply to human beings in our understanding of consciousness. We can also think about it this way. One might imagine that it was possible to understand scientifically and in every coherent way every single thing about the brain of the bat, or the bat as an organism. One can scientifically understand everything about the environment within which the bat exists and evolves. Does that mean that a scientist or a human can understand what it's like to be a bat? That is, can we in any way understand the experience of anything, even if we have all of the necessary prerequisite information? The answer is no. Obviously, the answer is no. Now, of course, many people go on to want to suggest that our very experiences as individuals is inescapably isolated from other people's experience. And other ways of putting it would be that women, for instance, have an experience in having babies, which men do not have. Because although men would have the objective information, they would never know what it was like to have the baby. Therefore, there's a kind of divide within us. I don't think it's necessary to take it down that route. In fact, I think Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, Immanuel Kant's concept of universal subjectivity is very helpful, because for Kant, although we are different people with different experiences, the very structure and nature of most of our experiences is so common and so universal that it's almost impossible for someone not to know what it's like to be someone else, that it's almost impossible for someone not to automatically sympathize with another person's experience, or at least imaginatively be able to think of it, quote unquote, from their point of view. So this isn't the same thing as that, but this is in many ways the same kind of question which gives rise to that puzzle. And this is the puzzle of subjective experience, the puzzle of first-person point of view. Because to slow down a little bit and make it a little bit more clear, what I'm trying to say is that on the basic level of experience, we have our senses, we have our eyes, we have our ears, we have our skin, and we have a kind of awareness which exists when we awake from sleep. There is unconsciousness, and then there is consciousness. Now, this is a crude kind of awareness because it's not self-awareness. In fact, it's not even necessarily individuated consciousness. It's a kind of creaturely existence which any animal who has a complex brain structure, who has senses, would have. And in fact, this isn't the point of the video or my discussion, but I in fact triumph this so-called simple consciousness as in fact being the very source of the richness of human experience, meaning that it's in reclaiming our hearing and reclaiming our eyes as the epitome of consciousness, through which I think we rescue like the existential sensory based specificity of our lives. I think we take back our lives by opening our senses like windows opening to the world. However, it has to be said that for many people, the triumph of human consciousness isn't that, because that is already shared with all other animals. So being a philosopher, I'm also prone to think that what is important about consciousness is its self-awareness. That is, its self-consciousness. Because what is you might imagine unique about human beings, although as a function of this question, ironically, we wouldn't have access to this answer. But as a function of human consciousness, it seems to be apparent that one unique thing about human experience is a particular kind of self-awareness. Obviously, it isn't that dolphins and whales and other complex organisms aren't self-aware in various respects. In fact, you could say that their self-awareness is unique to their specificity, and it's outside of our ability to even understand. So what we're in fact doing is not defending self-awareness as being unique as a form of speciesism. You know, speciesism is an accusatory term which is used against people who think of the human beings as being above animals, or think of the human beings as being unique, as if all human beings, or as if the speciesist, as it is assumed, is sort of like the American who makes the manifest destiny argument, who makes the argument that we have a manifest destiny to rule over this part of the hemisphere because we are somehow superior to other nations in the hemisphere. This is not speciesism, because this understanding of what is unique about self-consciousness that makes us human is fundamental, I think, to seeing or even sensing what is deeply mysterious about us, what is mysterious about the world, what is most mysterious about our life. And it's something that, because we're born into it, not merely as like using our senses and having a simple consciousness, but being a human being as being a socially conscious, linguistically grounded person, we discover that this self-awareness, which in many ways is related to two things to me, it's related to cognition and culture, cognition and culture, cognition being the individual experience of self-awareness, and culture as that thing outside of us, which is in language, which is in institutions, both invisible and real. And these are the things which are not as old as we think they are, because they're only as old as our symbolic language systems, meaning that culture emerges at the same time that our inner experience begins emerging, and there's a corollary between the two. And so the emergence of self-conscious thought is also related to the emergence of a self-consciousness about feeling. And this is in many mysterious ways related to a kind of imaginative experience which we are born into, and so unfortunately we take for granted, meaning that we have imaginations. We're born with not only feelings and emotions, but a complex set of relations to those emotional experiences. And that is a part and parcel of the way that we construct our experience, or our experience is constructed as such. This isn't necessarily related, but I think it's a way of hinting at why we see ourselves as being a significant species, because the kind of cognition that we practice is in many ways utterly unique. In fact, it could be seen as being a biological breakthrough akin to other breakthroughs in the biological world. For instance, osmosis, the capacity to turn sunlight into energy. That in itself is a parallel to the emergence of human consciousness when we understand it in its actual miraculousness, meaning that we understand it to be what another philosopher has called time binding. To be a critically conscious, cognitive, imaginative, self-aware human being means to stitch together the past and the future into the present, meaning we think symbolically. The symbol itself is a way of triangulating ourselves within time so as to both prepare ourselves for the future and to better understand the past, meaning that the maps that we make in our awareness are the very maps that we have needed to survive, but they're not always the same kind of maps that will allow us to continue. And so there's a built-in kind of flexibility. There's a built-in kind of epiphenomenal change, meaning that epiphenomenalism itself, which is the emergence of a memory outside of our DNA, is itself probably the purpose of cognition and culture. And so when I say epiphenomenal, What I mean to say is that the reason why human self-awareness is an absolutely significant element in the biological world that has to at least be seen as a sheer mystery is that what that brain is doing is attempting to externalize memories in a way that allows us to evolve with far more flexibility than we would if we had to genetically alter our biological basis. That is, and this is understood by anyone who understands epigenetics, what we are doing when we are speaking is in many ways protecting ourselves and saving ourselves in the same way that we do when we are planting food and when we are managing our time. We are giving ourselves an ability to alter our behaviors far more rapidly than we could otherwise, simply by changing our ideas, simply by changing our concepts. So the cognitive revolution of 30 to 70,000 years ago that gives birth to this self-awareness that I'm putting out to be as a significant element in our evolution, it is in many ways an evolution in this ability to be self-aware. And so it's no wonder that consciousness itself is reflective of this dynamic position that we are within. And this is especially clear when we no longer see ourselves as timeless beings, when we no longer see ourselves as souls outside of our bodies or as something that is somehow transcendental. When we begin seeing ourselves as organisms, that is, when we not only begin with Copernicus, when we begin seeing ourselves not as the center of the world, but as something that is a part of the world, it then makes it a lot easier to begin seeing ourselves in many ways as brains. That is, as persons who are within a Darwinian world. And yet, ironically, this isn't the end of the story, because one would think that a physical point of view would be all one would need. And in fact, for many philosophers, consciousness is not a question. It's something that is so obvious that it goes without saying. That is, consciousness is so ubiquitous with all experience that it cannot be defined. You know, there is a point of view which is so rigidly objective that it refuses to see subjectivity as having anything to do with our experience. And so this is sometimes associated with like the objectivism of Ayn Rand, but in many ways it's reflective of the positivism of the logical positivists, who are scientifically oriented philosophical thinkers who want to get rid of what they think of as superfluous. They want to get rid of everything they think of as merely unnecessary because they don't think it can be validated. That is, they want to dismiss any conception of consciousness which doesn't want to reduce us down to the kind of claims and understandings which can be empirically verified. Now, of course, this kind of reductivism and positivism has fallen out of favor in the most advanced philosophic thinking, in the most attentive ways of caring about the world. But it still exists in the minds of most anti-intellectual people who are not religious. It still exists as sort of a built-in point of view in almost everyone I meet who is not imaginative. It's not that the imaginative people don't give away to the most ludicrous, phantasmagorical, astrological, alchemical notions of the mind, but at least they have the courage to imagine something. At least they have the courage to think. It's not that they need courage, or courage is a value or a virtue in that sense. But what is most astonishing is the type of view which doesn't reach this point by a sort of logical sequence, but through a kind of insistence upon how tough they are. It's an insistence upon how clear-sighted they are, or so they think, insofar as they truly want to think of us merely as driven by power, as beings who are purely and thoroughly shaped by a cultural economic determinism. Meaning that consciousness itself is nothing other than an illusion. It's nothing other than not only an epiphenomenal gesture, not only an epiphenomenon, but an illusion itself, meaning that all of experience is without point, without relevance. because in many ways, experience and consciousness itself, from an evolutionary point of view, could be taken to be a way in which our DNA is replicating itself. And so consciousness itself could be a cathedral within which evolution is working to reproduce itself. And consciousness would be an element in that development. And so this is one variation or one staunch version of the multitude of views which are physicalist in orientation, in which want to see your thoughts, your feelings, your imagination, your entire mental life as a mere ghost, as a mere sideshow. And I am perhaps haunted, I think, by the idea that given the objective understanding that I have, or that we have, it seems impossible to value subjective experience in any way. Why not just forget about myself completely and put myself into the point of view which can think in a strictly logical, power-oriented point of view, which is cold and takes no prisoners. You know, when I was 19, I'd went to college and I discovered the distinction between subjective experience and objectivity. And I think it took me 10 years to actually understand what that meant. But the effects of that distinction began immediately at the age of 19. Because prior to that, at the age of 16, for whatever reason, I began dedicating myself to trying to understand the world as much as I could. Trying to understand history, trying to understand biology and chemistry and the sciences as much as I could, trying to understand philosophy, and trying to prioritize the knowledge that was outside of myself. Because what I saw as a problem, without really having the words for it, was an obsession with opinions, an obsession with a point of view, which thinks that because it's my point of view, it's valuable. In other words, I began to distinguish valuing my own feelings and my own thoughts, and instead valuing the objective world outside of me. In other words, I began to value the facts as being more important than what I wanted to believe. Now, of course, I'm just as deluded, perhaps more, than every other human being. But without realizing what I had done in doing that, especially in lieu of having a deep passion for the classics, for classic literature and philosophy and political theory, that what I also began developing was a severe reverence for paideia. Paideia meaning a reverence for the substantial, a reverence for the heroic, the sincere, and the courageous over the superfluous and irrelevant and silly. This is difficult to put into words even now, but especially then I had almost no words for what to me was an intense desire, an intense feeling, ultimately in many ways to eradicate my own subjectivity. That is, to prioritize a kind of self-awareness that would dull consciousness itself. That is, without realizing it, I began to deprioritize my own experience. I began to look down upon my own past and my own childhood as having no meaning, because I began to value people outside of me, their thoughts, their experiences, not at all as a way of like putting myself down or being self-effacing. It had nothing to do with that. It had to do with this inward decision that I'd made about where my focus would go. And I thought that the more my focus was on the world outside of myself, the more that I would grow and the better I would become. And not only that, but by measuring myself against the world outside of myself, by measuring myself against these great books, these great questions, by testing myself against these great ideas, that I was improving. At the same time, around the age of 20, I remember walking around at night or late in the evening when I was still at college and just being totally in a trance, a kind of beautiful trance, thinking about the question of consciousness. Because what I'd begun to intimate was that it's not that people don't know what they think they know, or that society doesn't know what it thinks it knows, or that these influences and authorities and texts that we think are so important are not what we think they are, but that we don't even have the questions right. I mean, I'm not sure what I mean, but when I began to discover that there was such a thing as the question of consciousness and that free will and determinism were a very real question, I began to have a taste for what I think younger people have when they take a taste for philosophy. Now, my motivations came from other places, and I was always already automatically a philosophical person. You know, I've always had philosophical questions. It's just that my own experience was largely without words, without concepts per se. That is, I was a philosophical child, except that I thought largely in images, in mythological forces. And so I say that because the discovery of philosophy at the age of 16, 17, and then at the age of 20, it was like an explosion. It was like an explosion from the inside, because I began to have a very clear sense that there was something astonishing about the difference between the existential, urgent, personal experience and questions that I had, and the objective world, which I was also wanting to value, which I was also wanting to attune myself to. And I saw, like a lot of young people do when they discover philosophy, I saw a great opportunity for power. With philosophy comes great power, and with great power comes the destruction of all responsibility. Because in many ways, one becomes a kind of wordsmith, and one cannot help but put other people in a trance as one is discovering themselves in a trance. And so one begins to value it, at least I did, began to become addicted to a kind of hyperbolic self-awareness, which wants to push self-reflection, which wants to push self-reflectivity to its utmost extreme and see where it would need. Meaning that I wanted to think and question the fundamental basis of knowledge, ethics, metaphysics, aesthetics. I wanted to confront the whole thing and push it as far as I could go. And in fact, I saw the entirety of self-consciousness as having to do with this kind of extreme points of view development that had to do with this kind of self-awareness, which I had hinted at earlier as not being, in fact, the very crown of consciousness. Because what I would later go on to discover is that although there is great pleasure, although there is great discovery and great understanding to be heard through this kind of process, which I'm even now continuing to develop, the real fruits themselves, the real richness is found in something that is in fact much more of a given, which is simple consciousness, which is the kind of awareness which, because we are all born into, we all most take for granted. And so, although I still think of this as being a fundamental question as to how we could explain consciousness or self-aware consciousness, I no longer value what would understood to be the very outcome of self-awareness. That is, I no longer value or even imagine to be the case the possibility of a final thought. In fact, I think of thinking as either on or off, in that so long as I'm thinking, nothing ends, nothing is with closure. So long as I'm thinking, I am being skeptical, even if that skepticism is fundamentally a kind of affirmation. And so I no longer think of thinking is operating in a programmatic, schematic way. I think of thinking as actually having a touch and go kind of characteristic. I think of thinking, including self-awareness, as actually operating as a kind of toolkit, as a kind of technique, as a kind of approach to what must be the specificity of actual problems. And so the problem, however, isn't that it's not that I think of these questions as being irrelevant because there is no problem. I understand myself as a particular kind of person to have the philosophical experience, which gives way to the question of consciousness, which gives way to the question as to how we can understand the elements of our consciousness as having a purely physical, biological basis. By the way, if you're thinking about the elements of your own experience, which are hard to explain merely through an objective scientific understanding, one must, as I've brought up before, begin with the you-ness of your experience. That is, you have to begin with the likeness of all thoughts, of all views, of all feelings. That is, there's something that it is like to be you. This is easily overlooked, but this is the most fundamental point. And in fact, this is probably the very basis of autonomy, which is that because there is something that it is like to be you, there is such a thing as subjectivity. And so although I had attempted to stamp out and extinguish my own subjectivity for years and years, it was ultimately in relaxing that I allowed myself to see that it is subjectivity, which on its most subliminal level is the fruit of life. It just doesn't have to be worked into something that is schematic. It doesn't have to be worked into something that is even logically consistent. Experience itself is logically inconsistent. And yet there are two other things which are also mysterious about experience. Two things besides the nature of subjectivity. One of those being that consciousness is always consciousness of something outside of ourselves. This is seemingly stupid. It seems absurd to point out, but it is overlooked. It's easily misunderstood, and it might be one of the most important things about our mental lives. And that is that consciousness is always consciousness of something. Meaning, you do not have pure consciousness. There's no such thing as self-awareness as such. What you are always having is a consciousness of something that is outside of yourself, whether it's in the physical, objective world, or whether it's of something imaginative. And something imaginative could be the thought that you have about outer space. Let's say you have a thought about the Big Bang. What is the nature of that thought? It's something that is constructed, and it's something that you can also do with your eyes closed. You can have a thought about Mars with your eyes closed. That in itself is a fundamental ontological experience. And so the ontological existence of objects is not merely in objects themselves, but even in the nature of concepts. And so the concept itself that we have is similar to the very dreams that we have, which are dreams about something. And so the quality of aboutness is the quality of intentionality. And what that means is that we do not have a consciousness of ourselves. Like, this is something that I could go into much further later, but it has to do with the fact that we are always a part of our world and not isolated from our world. It's a point about consciousness which frees us from thinking that we're locked inside of our brains, or that there's somehow some gap between us and the world outside of ourselves. There is no gap. And that's what intentionality means. And in fact, intentionality is deeply mysterious, because how is it that we have awareness of so many different kinds of things? It's not just that we have an awareness of the world outside of us, which means that I don't begin with the question of, is the world real or not? Although I will go into that question in another video. To me, the question has to do with the manifold nature of objects in our experience. And part of my own personal research and thinking in philosophy has to do with ontology and the ontological nature of surfaces, meaning how is it that we experience another person's face, someone that we know, or even a stranger, or our mother? How is it that that face exists as a physical surface, but in a kind of way which is not the same as another object? How is it that the surface of a book, in a strict technical sense, is not a surface, but a kind of imaginative stage within which our mental life is performing itself? This is a part of what cannot be really correlated so easily with brain chemistry. One is already rejecting the idea that we're somehow minds that are outside of the body or separate from the body, but one is also rejecting the possibility that intentionality or subjectivity can be reduced to correlatives in the brain. And this is what is meant by interiority itself. This is what is meant by the subjectivity of experience. And when one sees the third point about consciousness, which is its transparency, which is that it cannot be denied that even if you're having illusions, that those illusions are not real, that there's not an automatic kind of experience that doesn't sort of come along with being human. That in itself is another part of what prevents us from reducing our theory of consciousness to a way of understanding which is really out of touch with the various modes of being in reality, the various experiences that we have. And what I mean to say is not that objective knowledge doesn't exist, or that science doesn't produce subjective knowledge, or that science isn't valid. I'm completely on the side of the rational and the secular and the scientific. But when something must be rejected precisely because it can't be replicated as an experiment, then it shouldn't be rejected out of hand completely, meaning that so much of our experience and what we live through is unable to account for itself, except insofar as it is our lives. Then we have to ask ourselves more preliminary, more fundamental questions about how we prioritize our attention, how it is that we choose to value something that is conceptual over what we perceptually sense. So those are sort of like a number of the issues that are related to the question of consciousness. And to this day, I find it to be a question that is like the heart of philosophy for me, you know. And I mentioned the ways in which I've wrestled with the objective-subjective distinction, and I hope to make other videos where I go in further into that kind of distinction. But I also hope to make other videos about why it is that I value simple awareness rather than conceptualizing our ego or intelligence as being the prima facie place within which we are human. Because what I suspect is that when it comes to consciousness, so many of the problems that individuals face, and if there are such things as problems that the world faces, I think it has a lot to do with the degree to which many people have made the same kind of mistake that I made at the age of 19. The mistake isn't prioritizing the objective or the rational. It's that when you, to an extreme level, prioritize what is objective and what is rational and begin denuding, begin cheapening what is most immediate, what is in fact your very experience, I think you begin to have to question what it is exactly that you're doing when you're thinking at all. Because I think that championing the more fundamental elements of our own basic experience is in fact a way of taking back what concepts and rational thinking has done to our lives. And so I think when I make videos in the future about the power of perception and attention and awareness, it is in many ways an attempt to take back the life that philosophy has taken from me. But who knows? I guess we'll see what kind of videos come next, you know? I think the next video is going to have to do with a subject that's related to the last video about the mind-body problem, and it's related to this video about the question of consciousness, and that is the question of the self. What is the self? That is, who are you? These kind of questions have always been fundamental to me, not because I think they have answers, but because understanding the complexity of the questions, what is language, what is logic, what is experience, actually animates the very depth of our experience. And so you're probably sensing, if you're still listening, that that's sort of an element of what I'm doing in these videos, which are introductions to basic philosophical questions. I think these questions are not philosophical alone, but they are the questions of life. And I'm John Edward Willie, and you know I love doing this. I love you all. Have a good night.